And so we, at that time, we started the process, but George was still, to this day, probably one of the more complex reverse mortgages I've ever done. And that was because not only was it the first time I was going to do it, but he was presently at that time in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. And he was halfway through the bankruptcy, had another couple years left. And that added a layer of complexity because we had to do what's called a Chapter 13 buyout, which essentially you're getting approval from the courts to allow a refinance to happen and pay off the bankruptcy early. Aside from that, George was behind on his mortgage. The mortgage was not included in the bankruptcy. And there was a few other credit cards that also were not included in the bankruptcy that he was also behind on. He barely had any cash to his name. He was on the verge of losing his house. On top of it, George was disabled. So he was wheelchair bound. He was not mobile, or he wasn't as mobile. And so he couldn't get around to help me with getting papers signed, in a quick manner. Also, he wasn't able to go down to the courthouse either. And this is something I had to do for him. Because when you're in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, you have to file a motion to, in other words, get approval to be able to do the refinance. So I had to go down to the court office to file these motions and whatever else they requested. There was some, incomplete documents, so we had to go back, send more. So I was physically going on his behalf to file this paperwork. This was about a 3-month project. And throughout the process, I'm learning as I'm going. George was great. He was never got frustrated with me, and was there, just very encouraging to ultimately get the job done for himself. So we had a really good working relationship.